My mother-in-law kept hiding my medication, calling it strengthening, until I ended up hospitalized, and police found her diary documenting every incident. The seizure hit me in the kitchen while I was making coffee, my body convulsing on the tile floor hard enough to crack 2 ribs against the cabinet. My wife Natalie found me 20 minutes later when she came downstairs, foam dried on my lips, a pool of blood spreading from where my head had hit the counter edge. The paramedics said I was lucky to be alive, that going that long without my anti-seizure medication could have killed me. I'd been taking lamotrigine for 8 years without missing a dose until we moved in with Natalie's mother 3 months ago. Now I was strapped to a gurney being loaded into an ambulance, while my mother-in-law Patricia stood in the doorway wearing her bathrobe and an expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and satisfaction. She'd been the one who suggested I must have forgotten to take my pills that morning, her voice syrupy with false worry as she told the paramedics I'd been so forgetful lately, so stressed with the new job. The emergency room doctor asked me directly if I'd been taking my medication as prescribed, and I said yes, every single morning at 7 a.m. with breakfast, same routine for 8 years. He looked at my chart showing lamotrigine levels barely detectable in my bloodstream and asked if anyone had access to my medication besides me. I thought about the pill organizer I kept in the bathroom cabinet, the one I filled every Sunday night with a week's worth of doses. I thought about Patricia, who cleaned the house obsessively, who reorganized our belongings without asking, who had strong opinions about pharmaceutical companies and natural healing. The doctor must have seen something in my face because he asked the nurses to give us privacy, then closed the door and asked again if anyone might be interfering with my medication. I couldn't say it out loud, couldn't accuse my wife's mother of something so deliberately cruel. So I said I didn't know, and maybe I'd been more stressed than I realized. They kept me for 2 days, running tests and monitoring for brain damage from oxygen deprivation during the seizure. Natalie stayed with me the whole time, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, bringing me real food when the hospital meals made me nauseous. She kept asking how I could have missed so many doses without realizing it, and I didn't have an answer that made sense. My neurologist, Dr. Raymond Qley, came by on the second day looking concerned, pointing out that my lamotrigine levels suggested I hadn't taken medication in at least 4 or 5 days, possibly longer. He asked if I'd been experiencing any side effects that might have made me want to stop taking it, any reason I might have decided to quit cold turkey. I told him I would never do that, knew the risks, had been seizure-free for 7 years, specifically because I was religious about taking my medication. He made notes in my chart and suggested we might need to look at my home environment and daily routines more carefully. Patricia visited on the second afternoon, bringing homemade soup and a book about holistic wellness she thought I should read. She sat beside Natalie and talked about how modern medicine was wonderful, but sometimes the body needed to reset itself naturally, how dependency on pharmaceuticals could weaken a person's natural resilience. Natalie nodded along, looking exhausted while I lay there feeling my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. Patricia reached over and patted my hand, her grip firm and cold, telling me this was probably a blessing in disguise, my body's way of telling me I needed to make changes. She said when she was younger she'd had terrible migraines until she stopped taking pain medication and learned to push through naturally, strengthening her system. The way she looked at me when she said strengthening made my skin crawl, like she was sharing a private joke only she understood. Natalie asked her mother to let me rest, and Patricia left with promises to have the house deep cleaned before I came home, to make sure everything was perfect for my recovery. Dr. Qley discharged me with strict instructions to never miss a dose again, and a prescription for a higher initial dose to get my levels back up quickly. He gave me a medication log to fill out daily with times and doses, said sometimes writing it down helped people stay on track. The nurses gave me pamphlets about seizure safety and what to do if another one happened. I was sitting in the wheelchair, waiting for Natalie to bring the car around, when one of the nurses, an older woman named Ruth, leaned down and said quietly that she'd overheard my mother-in-law's comments about natural healing. She said in her 30 years of nursing, she'd seen families do terrible things to sick relatives in the name of helping them get stronger, and I should keep my medication somewhere only I could access it. The directness shocked me enough that I just nodded, and she squeezed my shoulder before walking away. I sat there in the wheelchair thinking about Patricia's face when the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance, that strange satisfaction hidden behind worry. We moved back home a week later, telling Patricia we needed our own space to establish better routines for my health. She'd been hurt at first, tears in her eyes as she talked about wanting to help us through this difficult time, about how much she'd looked forward to having family close after being alone since Natalie's father died. But Natalie held firm, said we appreciated everything Patricia had done, but needed privacy and independence. The morning we packed our things, I went to the bathroom to get my medication and found the pill organizer empty, completely empty. I'd filled it 3 days earlier with Monday through Sunday clearly labeled, and now every compartment was bare. Patricia was downstairs making breakfast and humming to herself. I stood there staring at the empty organizer, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation, that maybe I'd somehow taken all the pills without remembering, that maybe Natalie had moved them. but my hands were shaking when I went downstairs and asked Patricia if she'd seen my medication. She looked up from the eggs she was scrambling with an expression of confused concern, saying she hadn't touched my pills and was I sure I'd actually filled the organizer. I said I was positive, had done it Sunday night like always, but she just smiled and suggested maybe the seizure had affected my memory more than I realized. She said stress and trauma could make people forget things or misremember events, that it was completely normal. Natalie came in asking what was wrong, and Patricia explained that I seemed confused about my medication schedule. Natalie found the bottle of lamotrigine in the bathroom and handed it to me, asking if I wanted her to help me fill the organizer now to make sure it got done right. The way they both looked at me, patient and slightly worried, made me feel insane. I filled the organizer in front of them, while Patricia talked about how she'd read that seizures could cause temporary cognitive problems, and I shouldn't feel bad about needing extra help right now. I took my morning dose and put the organizer in my toiletry bag, along with the bottle, zipping it closed and taking the whole bag upstairs to pack in my suitcase. Our apartment was across town, a small 2-bedroom we'd been renting before the move to Patricia's house. We'd left to save money for a down payment on our own place, Patricia insisting we stay rent-free while we built our savings. Coming back felt like admitting failure, but also like escaping something I couldn't quite articulate. I put my medication in the bedroom closet on the top shelf where only I could reach it, started locking the bathroom door when I took my morning dose. Created routines that felt paranoid and necessary in equal measure. Natalie noticed but didn't comment, just asked periodically if I was taking my pills and if I wanted her to help me track doses. 3 weeks passed without incident, my lamotrigine levels climbing back to therapeutic range, Dr. Qley pleased with my progress. I started thinking I'd imagined the worst of it, that living with Patricia had just been stressful, and I'd actually been forgetting doses due to the disrupted routine. Patricia started calling every day, sometimes twice a day, asking how I was feeling and when we'd come visit. Natalie went to her mother's house for lunch every Thursday, and Patricia would ask pointed questions about my medication compliance, whether Natalie was monitoring me properly, if I seemed forgetful or confused. Natalie would report these conversations to me afterward looking troubled, saying her mother seemed obsessed with my health, but was probably just worried after seeing me have that seizure. I suggested maybe Patricia needed her own support, grief counseling or therapy to deal with losing her husband and now having an empty house again. Natalie agreed to talk to her mother about it, but when she did, Patricia got defensive and said she was fine. She just cared about family and wanted to make sure I was being taken care of properly, since clearly I couldn't manage it myself. The comment made Natalie angry enough that she stopped visiting for 2 weeks, which led to Patricia showing up at our apartment unannounced with apologies and more homemade soup. She started visiting every Sunday for dinner, a compromise Natalie negotiated, where Patricia could see us regularly without being intrusive. I tried to be gracious, tried to remember this was Natalie's mother, and she was grieving and lonely. But I started noticing small things. The way Patricia would volunteer to clear the table and wash dishes, taking her time in our kitchen. The way she'd ask to use our bathroom instead of the guest bathroom, saying the guest towels were too nice to dirty. The way she'd comment on where we kept things, saying she'd organize differently, but everyone had their own system. After her 3rd Sunday visit, I realized my bottle of lamotrigine had been moved in the medicine cabinet. Not missing, just repositioned from where I'd left it. I asked Natalie if she'd moved it and she said no. She hadn't touched my medication since we moved back home. I checked the pill count against my log and everything matched, so I told myself I was being paranoid, seeing threats where none existed. But the next Sunday, I set up my phone to record video in the bathroom, propped behind some towels with a view of the medicine cabinet. I felt guilty and ridiculous doing it, like I was betraying Patricia's trust over nothing. The phone recorded 2 hours of footage showing an empty bathroom until minute 87, when Patricia came in and closed the door. She spent 30 seconds looking at herself in the mirror, then opened the medicine cabinet and took out my lamotrigine bottle. She shook it, opened it, counted the pills by dumping them into her palm. Then she put 3 pills in her pocket and returned the rest to the bottle, placing it back exactly where it had been. She washed her hands, checked her reflection again, and left. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. I watched the video 3 times before showing Natalie, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Natalie's face went white, then red, then she was crying, saying there had to be an explanation. Maybe her mother thought the pills were expired and was trying to help. Maybe she was confused. I asked Natalie to call her mother right then and ask what she'd been doing in our bathroom during her visit. Natalie called and Patricia said she'd just used the toilet and washed her hands, nothing else. Why was Natalie asking such a strange question? Natalie said I thought I saw her doing something with the medicine cabinet, and Patricia laughed, said I must have imagined it, that seizures and medication changes could cause hallucinations and paranoia. She said she was worried about me, about whether the neurological damage might be worse than the doctors thought. Natalie told her mother she'd talk to her later and hung up, then asked to see the video again. We sat on the couch watching Patricia steal my medication while explaining to our faces that I was imagining things, and Natalie said in a small voice that her mother had been acting strange since the seizure, obsessive and controlling in ways she'd never been before. I asked if Patricia had always been this way, and Natalie just shook her head, saying she didn't know anymore what was normal and what wasn't. We filed a police report the next morning, bringing the video and my medication log showing 3 missing pills. The officer who took our statement, Detective Lauren Finch, asked why someone would steal just 3 pills of anti-seizure medication, and I explained that missing even 1 dose could trigger a seizure, that Patricia seemed to want me to have seizures. The words sounded insane out loud. Detective Finch asked if I had any proof Patricia wanted to harm me, and I said no, just the video of her stealing medication and lying about it. She said this could be criminal assault if we could prove intent to cause harm, but right now it just looked like theft of a controlled substance. She took copies of the video and my medication log and said she'd follow up, but I shouldn't expect much without evidence of deliberate harm. We left the police station feeling defeated and paranoid, wondering if we were overreacting to an old woman being weird and intrusive. Patricia called that afternoon saying Natalie had seemed upset on the phone and was everything okay? Was I having problems with my medication again? The concern in her voice was so genuine that I questioned my own memories, wondered if I'd misinterpreted the video. But Natalie told her mother we needed some space and not to visit for a while, and Patricia's voice changed, becoming sharp and hurt. She said she'd only ever tried to help us, that she'd opened her home when we needed it, and this was how we repaid her kindness. Natalie said we appreciated everything but needed boundaries right now, and Patricia said boundaries meant shutting out family, that Natalie had been so much happier before she married me, before I brought my problems and my pills and my paranoia into her life. The accusation made Natalie hang up shaking, and Patricia called back 6 times before we blocked her number. Text messages started coming through instead, long paragraphs about family loyalty and natural consequences and how pharmaceutical dependency destroyed people from the inside. Messages about how I was making Natalie choose between her husband and her mother. Messages about strength and weakness and what real love looked like. My next seizure happened 3 weeks later in the shower. Natalie heard the crash and found me unconscious on the tile, blood mixing with water from where I'd hit my head on the faucet. The paramedics asked the same questions as before, and this time I said clearly and directly that I suspected someone was tampering with my medication. They recorded it in their report, and the emergency room doctor ordered a complete workup including toxicology. Dr. Qley came to the hospital looking grim, saying 2 seizures in 2 months after 7 years of being controlled meant something was seriously wrong with either my medication compliance or my medication itself. I told him about the video and the police report and Patricia's behavior. He ordered the rest of my lamotrigine bottle sent to a lab for analysis and said if someone was tampering with my medication, that was attempted murder, not a family dispute. The legal term made everything real and terrifying in a way the police station visit hadn't. The lab results came back, showing my pills had been contaminated with diphenhydramine, a common antihistamine that could interfere with anti-seizure medication effectiveness. Someone had carefully injected liquid Benadryl into my lamotrigine capsules and sealed them back up, a process that required planning and intent. Dr. Qley showed me the lab report with his jaw clenched, saying in his 20 years of neurology he'd never seen anything like this. Never imagined a family member would deliberately sabotage seizure medication. He asked if I had any enemies who wanted me dead, and I said no. Just a mother-in-law who thought pharmaceuticals were weakness. Detective Finch came to the hospital that evening with a warrant to search Patricia's house, asking if Natalie wanted to be there when they executed it. Natalie said no. She couldn't watch her mother's house be torn apart, couldn't face the possibility that her mother really had tried to kill me. She stayed at my bedside crying while I was discharged with instructions to throw away all my current medication and get new prescriptions filled at a pharmacy far from our usual one. The search of Patricia's house turned up syringes and bottles of liquid diphenhydramine in her bedroom closet, hidden behind shoeboxes. They found my missing pills in a jewelry box on her dresser, carefully labeled with dates. But the discovery that changed everything was a leather-bound diary in her nightstand drawer, 200 pages of handwritten entries documenting every time she'd tampered with my medication over 4 months. The entries started the week we moved into her house, neat cursive describing how she'd removed 1 pill from my organizer to see if I'd notice, how I'd taken my morning dose without checking the count. The next entry celebrated how I hadn't noticed the missing pill, how this proved I wasn't paying attention and she could continue. Then pages describing each pill she removed or contaminated, observations about my behavior, notes about whether I seemed weaker or more confused, entries about how living in a weakened state would strengthen my body's natural defenses, how pharmaceutical dependency was destroying my masculine vitality, how she was helping me become the strong man her daughter deserved. The entry dated the morning of my first seizure was written in red ink, excited cursive about how my body was finally purging the chemical poisons, how the seizure was proof the natural healing process was working. She'd drawn a small heart next to the description of me convulsing on her kitchen floor. Subsequent entries expressed frustration that Natalie had moved us out before the treatment could continue, planning about how to regain access to my medication now that we lived separately. The Sunday visits were planned explicitly as opportunities to steal pills, with detailed notes about how many she took and where she hid them in her jewelry box like trophies. The most recent entries talked about escalating the treatment, about how I was clearly resistant to natural healing and might need a more dramatic intervention to break my pharmaceutical dependency permanently. The final entry was dated the morning before my second seizure, expressing confidence that this one would finally convince me to abandon medication and embrace natural strength. Detective Finch brought the diary to the hospital the next day in an evidence bag, asking me to confirm dates and details. I sat in the hospital bed reading my mother-in-law's careful documentation of trying to kill me while describing it as helping me, and felt something break inside my chest that I didn't think would ever heal properly. She'd numbered each pill theft like scientific observations, drawn charts tracking my decline, written affirmations about how strong I'd be once the healing was complete. There were 36 documented instances of tampering over 4 months, each one described with clinical detachment, except for the seizure entries which radiated satisfaction. Detective Finch said this was the most thoroughly documented attempted murder case she'd ever seen, that most criminals went to great lengths to hide evidence, while Patricia had created a detailed confession. She asked if I'd known Patricia had these beliefs about medication and natural healing before we moved in, and I said she'd always been somewhat alternative health-focused, but I'd thought it was just organic food and yoga, not deliberate poisoning. Patricia was arrested that evening at her house without incident, reportedly surprised that anyone viewed her actions as criminal. According to Detective Finch, Patricia's first statement was that she'd been trying to help me, that modern medicine was making me weak and dependent, that she'd carefully researched safe methods to wean me off pharmaceutical poison. She'd brought her diary to the police station herself, offering it as proof that she'd been monitoring my progress and ensuring the treatment wasn't causing lasting harm. The detective said Patricia seemed genuinely confused about why strengthening my natural resilience was considered a crime. She'd been charged with attempted murder, assault with intent to cause bodily harm, and tampering with pharmaceutical products. Her bail was set at $200,000, and her lawyer immediately argued for house arrest given her age and lack of criminal history, but the prosecutor pointed to the diary entries celebrating my seizures, and the judge denied bail entirely. Natalie spiraled into a breakdown that required psychiatric intervention. Unable to reconcile the mother who'd raised her with the woman who'd systematically poisoned her husband while documenting the process, she moved into a hotel for a week because she couldn't stand being in our apartment where Patricia had stolen my medication. Couldn't stand being near me because my presence reminded her of what her mother had done. Her brother Kyle flew in from Oregon and spent 3 days trying to make sense of how their mother could have done this, reading the diary entries over and over looking for signs of mental illness or dementia that might explain the calculated cruelty. He told me he'd always known their mother was controlling and judgmental, but never thought she was dangerous. He said when their father died 2 years ago, Patricia had become obsessive about health and wellness, attending seminars about natural healing and pharmaceutical conspiracy theories, but he'd written it off as grief-driven coping mechanisms. The preliminary hearing happened 6 weeks after my second seizure. Natalie and I sitting in the courtroom while Patricia was led in, wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed absurd on a 68-year-old woman who looked like someone's grandmother. She smiled when she saw us, a warm, genuine smile like we were meeting for coffee instead of a criminal proceeding. Her lawyer argued that Patricia suffered from delusional disorder, that she genuinely believed she was helping me through alternative treatment methods, that her mental illness made her unable to understand the criminal nature of her actions. The prosecutor countered with the diary showing careful planning and documentation, arguing that someone with Patricia's level of organization and intent could not claim insanity. The judge ruled there was sufficient evidence for trial and scheduled it for 3 months out, sending Patricia back to county jail while her lawyer filed motions for psychiatric evaluation. The psychiatric evaluation took 6 weeks, during which 3 different doctors examined Patricia and reviewed her diary. All 3 concluded she was legally sane and competent to stand trial, that while she held unconventional beliefs about pharmaceutical medicine, she understood right from wrong and had chosen to hide her actions because she knew others would disapprove. The forensic psychiatrist's report noted that Patricia demonstrated narcissistic traits and a profound need for control, particularly over her daughter's life and choices. She'd viewed my presence as a threat to her relationship with Natalie and had attempted to eliminate that threat through methods she could rationalize as helping, rather than harming. The report concluded Patricia was dangerous specifically to me and should have no contact with either me or Natalie pending trial. Her lawyer tried to suppress the psychiatric evaluation as prejudicial, but the judge allowed it, saying Patricia's mental state was central to the attempted murder charges. My new neurologist, Dr. Evelyn Cho, spent months rebuilding my medication regimen and my trust in it, knowing that Patricia's tampering had created trauma around the very pills that kept me alive. Every morning, I'd stare at my lamotrigine capsules wondering if they'd been contaminated, if today would be the day another seizure killed me. Dr. Cho had my prescriptions filled at a compounding pharmacy that sealed each dose in tamper-evident packaging, gave me detailed instructions about checking for signs of contamination, helped me develop rituals that felt safe. She also referred me to a therapist named Gregory Hunt, who specialized in medical trauma and family betrayal. Gregory helped me process the reality that my mother-in-law had tried to kill me, not out of hatred, but out of love, believing she was saving me from pharmaceutical weakness. Somehow, that made it worse, knowing Patricia genuinely thought repeated seizures would strengthen me. The evidence against Patricia was overwhelming, but her defense team fought every charge, arguing that she lacked intent to cause permanent harm, that she'd believed she was providing alternative medical treatment, that her actions were misguided help rather than criminal assault. The prosecutor brought in medical experts who testified about the dangers of untreated epilepsy, how each seizure risked brain damage or death, how someone with Patricia's level of education and access to medical information could not claim ignorance about these risks. They presented the diary entries celebrating my seizures as proof of intent to cause harm, regardless of her stated beliefs about natural healing. Patricia's lawyer countered with character witnesses describing her as a devoted mother and community volunteer, suggesting that grief over her husband's death had triggered a temporary break from reality. The strategy fell apart when the prosecutor revealed Patricia had been attending anti-pharmaceutical wellness seminars for 18 months before her husband died, that this wasn't grief-driven delusion, but long-held ideology she'd decided to impose on me. Natalie testified for the prosecution despite her lawyer's advice against it, saying she needed to face her mother in court and speak the truth about what had been stolen from her family. She described growing up with a mother who was loving but controlling, who had strong opinions about weakness and strength, who valued toughness over vulnerability. She talked about how after her father's death, Patricia had become increasingly obsessed with health and natural healing, how she'd tried to convince Natalie to stop using birth control and stop taking vitamin supplements, claiming pharmaceutical products weakened women's natural fertility and vitality. Natalie said she'd dismissed these concerns as her mother processing grief, never imagining Patricia would act on her beliefs by poisoning someone. When asked directly if she thought her mother intended to kill me, Natalie said quietly that she thought Patricia intended to force me into a medical crisis that would make me abandon medication, and didn't care if that crisis killed me as long as it proved her ideology correct. The courtroom went silent after that statement, and Patricia stared at her daughter with an expression of betrayal. Patricia took the stand against her lawyer's recommendation, insisting on explaining her actions in her own words. She spoke for 40 minutes about pharmaceutical industry corruption, about how anti-seizure medications created dependency rather than healing, about how she'd researched safe methods to wean people off medication by gradually reducing doses and introducing natural alternatives. She described each instance of removing pills or contaminating them with diphenhydramine as careful medical treatment, showing the jury her diary as proof of how thoroughly she'd monitored my response. She said the seizures had been unfortunate but necessary steps in the healing process, comparable to withdrawal symptoms during detox from addictive substances. She'd hoped I would recognize the seizures as my body purging chemical toxins and choose to continue the natural path. When the prosecutor asked if she understood that her tampering had nearly killed me twice, Patricia said death was always a risk during healing crises, but she'd been confident I was strong enough to survive the treatment. The jury looked horrified. The prosecutor asked Patricia if she'd told me or anyone else about her treatment plan before implementing it, and she said no, because modern medicine had brainwashed people into fearing natural healing, making them unable to consent to alternatives rationally. She'd needed to demonstrate the effectiveness of her methods before people could judge them fairly. When asked if she regretted her actions given that I'd nearly died, Patricia said she regretted that the treatment had been interrupted before completion, that if Natalie hadn't moved us out, and if the police hadn't interfered, I would now be seizure-free without medication dependency. She said my current reliance on pharmaceuticals proved her treatment hadn't been given enough time to work. The prosecutor asked her directly if she would do it again given the chance, and Patricia said yes, because helping people overcome pharmaceutical dependency was more important than avoiding legal consequences. Her lawyer's face went pale, and he asked for a recess, probably to yell at his client for confessing to premeditated attempted murder on the stand. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, coming back with guilty verdicts on all charges including attempted murder, assault with intent to cause great bodily harm, and tampering with consumer products. Patricia showed no emotion when the verdicts were read, just nodded slightly like the jury had confirmed something she already knew. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge called Patricia's actions some of the most disturbing he'd encountered in 25 years on the bench, not because of their violence, but because of their calculated nature disguised as care. He said Patricia had weaponized her position as a trusted family member to systematically poison someone who'd welcomed her into his life, documenting each step with pride. He sentenced her to 15 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 10 years, noting that her complete lack of remorse and stated willingness to repeat her actions made her an ongoing danger. Patricia smiled at the sentence like she'd won something, and was led out of the courtroom still smiling while Natalie sobbed beside me. 3 years later, I take my medication every morning from tamper-evident packaging delivered monthly by a pharmacy that doesn't know Patricia exists. I've been seizure-free since the contaminated pills were thrown away, my lamotrigine levels stable, my life rebuilt around routines that feel safe. Natalie and I moved across the country to get distance from everything that happened, from the courtroom and the jail and the house where her mother tried to kill me. We're in therapy individually and together, working through the reality that love can be toxic, that family can be dangerous, that trust once broken never quite repairs the same way. Patricia writes letters from prison that we return unopened, long essays about how time will prove her methods right, how I'll eventually understand she was trying to save me. Natalie's brother Kyle visits her occasionally and reports that she remains convinced she did nothing wrong, that the pharmaceutical industry's grip on society is so complete that even attempted healing is criminalized. I don't know if she'll ever understand what she did to me, to us, to her own daughter. I just know I'm alive despite her best efforts, and that sometimes surviving someone's love is the hardest thing you'll ever do.